Hey, it's me. Hi, baby gang. How are you? This video is a little different because I don't really feel like video editing, but I also kind of feel like at this point it's more natural for me to just speak openly for this channel. I have more limited amounts of time for video editing, and I also can just kind of picture myself enjoying a bit more open discussion. That might sound a little bit boring because I say "oh" and I stumble a lot and stuff like that, but I'm kind of inspired by Amanda BB's videos and people like that who make these really cool videos. Usually they're doing their makeup and stuff. I don't do my own makeup. I don't actually do makeup at all, really, but maybe I'll try that one day and that'll make a good video. Maybe I'll get some good content out of that. But today, the only content that I can really focus on is something regarding Twitter. It's something that I've been trying to make a video on for a while, and I'll be making more videos on in the future, to be frank. But I think that Twitter is a place that is very important and interesting and fascinating to study and, to look at from an external standpoint, to observe. But being on Twitter is an experience that is worth thinking about a lot, and I think a lot of people around me have been thinking about their experiences with Twitter a lot for quite some time. And so I want to talk about Twitter a little bit today. I'm pulling out my notes as I do this. I'm not being rude and reading text messages or anything. But if I was, who cares? But I actually would like to kind of speak to you guys about maybe leaving Twitter. Now, I don't know if I'm necessarily going to leave Twitter. I don't think that that's necessarily going to be a thing that I do. Why am I just... Okay. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be a thing that I do, but I've taken some time out to deactivate for small periods of time recently, and I've just found that it's been helpful. I've found that cutting myself off from Twitter is sometimes the best thing to do, and sometimes when I cut myself off from Twitter, I get this feeling in my heart like I don't want to go back, and that's a little bit alarming. But you know what? My brother told me when I said that I had deactivated my Twitter originally, he said, "What are you thinking? You want to be a content creator for so long, and now you have this following on Twitter, and you just gotta leave Twitter? What are you talking about?" And I was like, yeah, I'm kind of a slave to my engagement. So I did bring my Twitter back partially for those reasons, but also partially because to some degree there are benefits to being on Twitter. To some degree there are things that you can do on Twitter that can be valuable to your life. However, there are so many things on Twitter that are toxic, capital T, toxic. That's the word that we like to use these days. There are so many things on Twitter that are really toxic that it kind of gets lost in the shuffle how certain things might be valuable or enjoyable to us. I mean, honestly, half the time, most of the time, my experience of using Twitter is not fun. It's not enjoyable. I turn on my phone, I look at Twitter, I scroll through the timeline, and I just feel like my heart is still. I feel like my heart just stops beating or it beats too fast. I feel weird and annoyed, and my face dries up, and yeah, it's just a lot of feelings that I don't know if that's the thing that I should be feeling, especially at 23 and with all these different things that I want to do, and the weather's great outside, and I don't know. It's hard, right? Because during these pandemic times, it can be very difficult to figure out anything to do, and that's why we have leaned on our social media dependencies more than ever during this time period. But that doesn't mean that Twitter and even other social media apps has to be the thing, right? Maybe we should think about leaving. So I've had a few friends recently that left. This past week has been a freaking mess on Stan Twitter, which is sort of where I reside. I'm a BTS ARMY, as you know, so a lot of you guys watching are going to be ARMYs too. And I mean, in short, first of all, there's always kind of infighting and toxicity and fighting with antis and people saying all kinds of racist nonsense about BTS and all kinds of classist weird stuff about BTS ARMYs. And that kind of stuff you you kind of get used to in a bad way because you get so accustomed to it that you don't realize how much of it really drains you. But this past week, and this is something that I don't want to talk about too much, but trigger warning, it's just related to sexual assault. There was a sexual assault case that popped up in K-pop with a former K-pop star, and for some reason certain trolls on Stan Twitter decided that this was going to be a good thing to make a meme out of, and they started spreading false sexual assault rumors about members of BTS. And there's no way to really sugarcoat that. That's a thing that happened. It's a thing that has happened many times before. It's a thing that has happened to other pop stars. We don't have to get into sexual assault discourse or believing women discourse right now. I'm the wrong person to have that conversation with you as a non-woman. And I feel very uncomfortable about the subject matter in general because of, I don't know, a variety of weird experiences that I have dealt with and experiences of people around me. What I just want to say is that, like, and I want to clarify, I'm not a victim of sexual assault. What I just want to say is, like, that was a moment where a lot of people realized or felt in their heart that it was just too much. Dear friends of mine who use Twitter very often, who have defended their usage of Twitter to me before and been like, well, this is the only thing that we got, have felt like Twitter's just basically gone for them because they've just become completely overwhelmed with the ways in which Twitter has become so dark. You know, it's one thing when it's just fan wars and fans being toxic and people talking smack on the internet. And it's another thing when you're constantly being presented with information and ideas that will trigger you, things that make you feel inferior, things that make you so angry to the point where you're doing things that you don't think you should do. And for me, that's the one thing that really makes me the most uncomfortable. Thankfully, I haven't had so many experiences in my life to where post-traumatic stress disorder is an issue, and I'm fairly, unemotional when it comes to certain things, but what kind of scares me and freaks me out and makes me really neurotic and anxious is the blurred lines and the black and white and reconciling when it is that we are going to pick which is the one that we're going to talk about or approach things with. I mean, like, when things that are negative happen on the timeline, when things that are negative happen on Twitter, and for example, somebody says some nonsense, a lot of the people that I've made friends with through Twitter that I find to be very intelligent and cool people, you can see that their buttons are being pushed to a level that they're losing control of their ability to really, like, do what's best for them or, like, say what they want to say, and they end up just saying things that are quite out of frustration about, like, I don't know, just, I guess, violent stuff and, like, nonsense or whatever. And on one hand, you're like, well, that's bad. But on the other hand, you're like, I get it. And I kind of feel exactly what you feel. And those blurred lines are what freak me out the most. Because these folks could be doing so much more. And I don't want to sound patronizing, actually, but sometimes I just don't know what's right and what's wrong anymore. And I don't think that a essentialized idea of right and wrong is really the best way to look at the world, but it can be good to feel like a moral compass is guiding you through certain decisions to where you know where you want to stop and where you want to keep going. And it feels like, depending on how my mood switches so vigorously through navigating Twitter, at points my compass will just change, and so I won't be able to decide whether I want to be reconciliatory or whether I want to be abrasive whether I want to be attacking people or calling people out, I should say, I lose sense of like what's consequences and what's negativity. I lose sense of what's kindness and what's complicitness, or what's, ignorance. And I feel like these are complicated questions that none of us are really able to like fully define or answer, I should say. But when we are on Twitter, the black and white nature of Twitter, which incentivizes us to ratio or to hit like, to retweet, to quote tweet and respond, to call out, to DM, to attack, whatever the case might be, there's not really a place for blurred lines on these spaces. And, I want to clarify that this isn't really just a Stan Twitter thing, which is something that I kind of feel quite apprehensive about, because I know a lot of my friends who are just being completely enraged by what they're seeing on Stan Twitter, rightfully so, feel quite angry and dismissive towards Stan Twitter in general. And I get it, because Stan Twitter is it's a pretty awful place, to be honest with you. But at the same time, there's a couple of things that I think about when I think about why Stan Twitter is awful and what that means in the greater context of things. Obviously, Stan Twitter is not the only place on Twitter where things are awful. Politics Twitter is bad, and gaming Twitter can be really bad. All these different spaces, even marginalized spaces, especially marginalized community spaces on Twitter, there's a constant dog eat dog, people feeding on each other, people defining each other's personhood, that can completely tear a person apart. I've made accomplices, or like acquaintances, I should say, not accomplices, acquaintances with people who are quite young, and seeing themselves being represented in these marginalized communities and like navigating these freaking insane discourses, I can't imagine how much that could beat you up inside. And so that is what really troubles me, is the gray. It's not even necessarily just the awful stuff, although the awful stuff is really bad. It's the ways in which the awful stuff affects us, and where we have to draw the line between fighting against it and just accepting it, letting go, and doing what's best for us, like in terms of just trying to find our space. Because, to be quite frank, these things like making up sexual assault accusations, attacking people on Twitter, all types of triggering, bigoted things, these are not new, and these are not really things that we are able to stop, particularly as individuals. And we've individualized the process of figuring out answers. There's a very palpable lack of collectivism, especially now. Even as we recognize that our answers have to lie in collectives and we have to come together and unify, like, people are less and less willing to do that, because they're navigating the system in which everything is messed up. And so seeing how that messed up system is embodied in other people around you, of course you want to reject people. Of course you don't want to associate with people. It just feels like we've lost the plot, Excuse me, let me drink some water. Refresh, hydrate. So, in general, I ask people right now something that I've kind of asked of people for a while, to be honest with you, particularly within army spaces. There you go, sentences. I've had conversations with people before where I'm like, yo, get off Twitter. You're doing amazing stuff. You have an amazing capacity for bringing change, for doing cool stuff, and you're limiting yourself to the output you put out on Twitter. You got to do a little bit more than that. Like, you got to leave Twitter and go put yourself in places where you can be seen for something other than being a stan on Stan Twitter. And also recognizing that, yes, there's this imminent toxicity on Twitter that's only getting worse, wherein people are just being worse and worse every day, microanalyzing each other, attacking each other, quote unquote canceling each other, whatever. And yet nothing better seems to come of it. Where are the good changes, you know? And that's because it's an individualized system. It's not people coming together to collectively decide on things that are actions. It's people individually saying something is bad, and then people sort of mobbing around opinions, but not really choosing to create collective action. So that's why there's a fucking palpable missing sense of unity and actual change that's positive, because everybody's actually up against each other, even as people are actively trying to advocate for each other. That's my 2 cents on that. Whether that makes sense or not, who knows, you know, who knows. But what I have to say in general, first of all, is that Twitter is not the only toxic app. People on other platforms love to talk shit about Twitter, love to talk about how Twitter is the worst place, the bad place, the place where all the toxic people are, and you don't want to be on Twitter, you don't want to be like those Twitter people, etc., etc. And, you know, kind of, right? Because every single app has its own vibe. And you kind of have to find your own vibe within that. However, every single app has its toxicity that can really wear on you, particularly if you use it to a large extent. People have always talked about how Instagram makes you jealous of people and makes you get FOMO and all these other things. I kind of get that. I've been caught up on Instagram too many times, like mindlessly scrolling. But, you know, even in other social media apps where there are communities like Reddit, you see dogpiling and ridiculous ideas and misinformation and all this other stuff happen quite often. Similar stuff to what happens on Twitter, but there's just a different sense in how information is presented and how people, you know, bring these pieces of information or this content to light on these apps, you know. On Reddit, you have a subreddit, so there's a certain community in each subreddit, theoretically, but then you can kind of travel between each community, so people get brigaded all the time. You know, brigaded meaning people from other subreddits will come and, you know, whatever, like inflict their own thing. Then you got just like a ridiculous amount of people like just claiming whatever, because it's such a more comment oriented thing, and there's not as much attacks and vigorous debates on Reddit, but there's much more circle jerking, and there's much more just people saying stuff that doesn't even necessarily make sense or isn't necessarily good, but just saying it because that's where the vibe is. And that can easily be, you know, used for dog whistles and stuff, because sometimes the vibes are white supremacists, low-key. So that's a very complicated conversation, but to be honest with you, I don't need to explain to you why Reddit is toxic. You've probably been on Reddit, and you've probably seen a lot of bullshit on Reddit. It's home to a lot of bigotry and a lot of people with stupid ideas that think that they're actually smarter than everybody else because they haven't looked towards thinkers and books and different things that challenge those ideas once in their lives. They just sit around and have their thinkies and then go on Twitter or go on Reddit and talk about them and act like they're purely logical when in fact they're actually quite emotional based off of the information that they're actually outputting. I don't know, I'm talking a lot of smack, but basically what I'm saying is every app is toxic. Twitter, you know, arguably is the most toxic, but it's the way in which Twitter facilitates the information that is what leads to it being the way that it is. You know, you have just this constant flood of information and this constant need for people to sort of gain clout or gain attention from that information. And so it's just this constant attention battle guised as conversation and information sending. So there's all that. My whole thing is use apps as tools. Use them sparingly and use them to your advantage. Don't use apps as homes. This is something that I've had to learn time and again, and it's something that I'm still bad at, but I've treated Twitter as a home, as a place where I reside, and this is my community on Twitter and stuff like that. And that's kind of a thing, That's kind of a thing. There's all these intra-communities and small places of, when you have a following that, you get these same people replying and all that stuff, but that's not a healthy place for me to sit. I'm sitting here. I'm sitting in my room. I have to remain in my life. Twitter has to be something that I step into, like a room, to do a couple things, do some business or whatever, and step out. As a content creator, it's a great place to promote my stuff. It's a great place to promote ideas and put memes out and stuff. But it's not a place that I want to spend too much time on. And I'm getting a sense that a lot of you might not want to spend too much time on it either. So here's just some tips to close this video out on how to deal with Twitter and how to move forward. For one, like I said before, diversify. People were challenging me on Stan Twitter or on Army Twitter, saying, we can't let Army Twitter go, and this is where we organize, this is where everything is, or this is where the Tannies post, like it is in BTS. This is where BTS posts, so I want to be here because I want to see these posts and stuff like that. Fair, but you don't have to leave the app completely. You can just follow BTS, just see BTS on your timeline, and a couple other people or whatever. Like it, retweet some organizing stuff, retweet some One in an Army donation stuff, retweet some chart streaming stuff, and then that's your 20 minutes, and then you go and then you live your regular life. It's not a place that you should be hanging out. And people talk also about there's just people who are so toxic and conspiratorial and reactionary that have popped up in Stan Twitter. They're always like this. There have always been people like this that are gays and who make up rumors about the group and who are constantly victimizing members of the group and pitting them against each other and attacking other stands and all that stuff. And what if we don't respond to them, if we don't fight them, then they'll just continue to fester and grow. But I don't think fighting them in the way that we fought them has done anything to stop their festering or growth. I see constant appeals on the timeline to fight the solo stands or fight this, and that. But at the same time, we've been constantly saying, damn, people keep becoming solo stands. This is just growing. They keep getting more and more power. And then we blame people there's big accounts. The problem is these big accounts, and the problem is these different people. This is all very jargony and nonsense if you don't live on Stan Twitter, but it's kind of a bigger thing because reactionaries do feed off of Twitter and other social media apps. Conspiracy theorists, right-wing neocons, Nazis, QAnon people. QAnon people have infiltrated into young leftist spaces because a lot of kids that don't know any better, that think that they understand communism because they watched a couple of BreadTube videos and started reading one Karl Marx book, will see some stuff pop up on the timeline like conspiracies about pedophilia or whatever and be like, oh yeah, you know what, that makes perfect sense, and then just start accusing celebrities of being massive pedophiles or whatever. And then it won't be true, and then they'll be like, oops. So everything is tainted on Twitter because it is so perfect and ripe for reactionary behavior. It doesn't just have to be bad reactionaries, the one that we're trying to fight. You can't fight bad reactionaries with good reactionaries. I don't think so. Maybe. You can fight them with populists, perhaps, but it's rare to find something that charismatic, and you don't usually get charismatic singular leaders in stand spaces because you don't want to concentrate so much power in fandoms. Again, if you don't understand stand stuff, this is probably all gobbledygook for you, but what I'm basically trying to say is don't consider yourself a soldier fighting the good fight against reactionaries on Twitter. You're gonna just be miserable and it's not gonna be effective. You can't fight them just by quote tweeting them and attacking them and getting a bunch of upvotes from your friends. and creating more and more dogpiling and more toxic nonsense on Twitter. Part of the way that you take away their power is by taking away the attention and the strength in their community and in the resources that they have in building their communities. Meaning, like, if Twitter is so perfect for reactionaries to build on, then maybe part of the problem is just Twitter. And part of the problem is that we need to push Twitter, push the executives, because really this all comes back down to the executives and the executive groups and stuff like that, the companies. This is really all their fault. Let's be honest about that. Maybe we need to create spaces, or create spaces for ourselves, or whatever the case might be, that can be where the power is generated, instead of relying on a space that is so easily manipulated by reactionaries. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, like, Twitter is just really bad for leftism. Twitter's been really bad for politics because it's conditioned to reactionary type stuff. It's conditioned to vague populism. It's conditioned to appeals to larger audiences that are concentrating their energy in one direction. Not the group, like one direction. So, well, maybe the group too. So all that really happens is people just fight each other. I've never seen anybody make Twitter into something positive. And people talk all about, armies used to be so popular, and these stand spaces used to be a lot easier and calmer and whatever. You can't go back in time. You can't make stand Twitter great again. You can't make army Twitter great again. You can't make Twitter great again. If you have this idea, this visage of a time where Twitter was this great place and we need to go back there, just let that go. It's not going to happen. Maybe you can argue to me that you can make a new way in the future. That's where I want to hear you, lead things. But just this idea that we can somehow control the central orb of information and educate people on Twitter so that we all mobilize correctly, I just don't feel like it's worth our time. Because Twitter, it's just not good enough in terms of giving you tools to fight these people. The better tools, for fighting reactionary behavior are on, like, YouTube, because you can create content. You don't have to get your content, like, your content doesn't have to get, like, super, flagged and weighed down by negative interaction. You don't have to worry so much about the content leaving the timeline and never being seen again, because a YouTube video just stays there and it stays on your channel. You can always link it to people. And you don't, there's all these different things that make Twitter just much better, the YouTube much better for content, because it's literally a content creation platform, whereas Twitter is a communication platform. But a communication platform, again, it's incentivized towards people getting engagement. The more engagement you get, the more engagement you get. And the more engagement you get, the more influence, right? So how do you get more engagement? By doing stuff that gets people's attention and makes them want to click like. There's many ways to do that, and most of them don't involve telling the truth, because the truth is always complicated. Complication, nuance, thoughtful, discretionary behavior, it doesn't really jive with how Twitter works, especially right now, because that's another thing to keep in mind. Like, if you want to bring Twitter back to where it was before, the literal algorithms and the layout of the site. By the way, the layout of Twitter right now sucks. Just different now. So use Twitter as a space in which you can communicate with people, make friends, build an audience, build a following, all this other stuff. Use Twitter as a place where you can, grow a business by communicating, share memes, make people laugh, make people smile, whatever. Find ways to laugh and smile by looking at dog content and things like that. But or it can be a place where you can get a lot of information. If you find some trusted accounts, and you can find so much information. Like, for example, I follow Zach Fox on Twitter. He's a comedian, and he'll share interesting leftist resources. So as long as you know where the information is coming from, and you know it's a trustworthy place because the sources are cited and everything seems like thoughtfully composed and not just written to be reactionary. When you got that going for you, then you can find some great information on Twitter. But to be honest, that's if you're using Twitter openly and not, within a small narrow space, you're gonna get so much nonsense in your face all the time, and it's gonna make you more reactionary, more angry. So to be honest, I think the key is use Twitter as a tool for what it's good at, and then leave it, and then start making use of these other platforms. Start making use of platforms that are calmer and easier for you to use. Start making use of non-platforms. Start making use of your online time that is not spent on social media, like reading PDFs and stuff like that. Start using your time to be offline in general. Turn your screens off. Wake up in the morning, don't turn your laptop on, don't turn your phone on, just meditate. There's so many better uses of your time than trying to fight reactionary stuff on a website designed for reactionary stuff. You might as well go to 4chan and tell people to stop memeing. How can we change the culture of 4chan? Get the hell out of here. It's not going to happen. Especially given that cultural forces change on their own. They don't change because one human decided to change things. We give a ridiculous amount of credence to that. So, these ideas are very complicated, and hopefully I'll live stream soon and get more of those out in a constructive way, but use Twitter as a tool. Use it carefully, use it for short periods of time. Avoid exposing yourself to too much stuff that's going to make you depressed and angry. Relocate to other apps, find life and use in other apps and websites. Read and do other stuff online. Do more stuff offline. Be prepared for the great pivot away from Twitter, because it's coming. It's just not sustainable anymore. The sender can't hold, and trying to fight that is just gonna make you more and more miserable. Just find the little bits of joy that you can from the website. If you can't find them, go. Just get out. At the end of the day, if something's making you miserable, cut it off. And God, I wish more people would just do that for themselves. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being conceited or whatever, but it's hard. I can't do it sometimes. It's really hard. But yeah, those are my thoughts. It's time to just really consider getting off of Twitter. Reconsider how you use Twitter. Use Twitter purposefully. And yeah. And alright, I guess I'm good. So thanks for coming around. Let's end this with a bit of breathing. So everybody take a deep breath in if you're still here. 1, 2, 3. Out. In. Out. In. I'm here. Say, I'm here. And have a good time. Be good. See you soon. Oh, I didn't turn it off.